We'll introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Hyun Bang Shin right here in the grey jacket, Professor of Geography and Urban Studies, and I believe Head of Department of...
You don't have to say that.
You what? Head of Department, Head of Geography and Environment at LSE. Hyun works on urbanisation, gentrification, housing and cities in China, Korea and Southeast Asia. We also have right here Olivia Cheung, Research Fellow at the China Institute at SOAS. Olivia is a political scientist and author of the excellent Factional Ideological Conflicts in Chinese Politics, as well as The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, co-authored with Steve Tang. Bill Hurst right here is the Chonghua Professor of Chinese Development in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge, as well as co-director at the Center for Geopolitics. Bill works on many things, including the politics of development, urban politics, social movements, and contentious politics. And over here, we have Yimin Zhao, Assistant Professor at Durham in the Department of Geography, with expertise in critical urban studies and the politics of urban change, often looking at issues through the lens of language, materiality, and everyday life. So I'm Jane Hayward, lecturer in China and Global Affairs at the Lao China Institute. Let me just say something, first of all, about why I wanted to organize this panel on the urban question. So my PhD, a very long time ago, was on something called the agrarian question, looking at the agrarian question specifically in China. But the agrarian question originally was a question that was asked by European socialists who, they were asking this question originally in the late 1800s, influenced by Marx, of course. They were looking out for the development of capitalism in their own countries to see if it was happening, because the idea was that if capitalism develops, basically, if you want to get to communism, according to Marx, you have to go through capitalism first. So they're looking out to see if it's developing in their own countries. And what they were looking for was, are the peasantries in our country disappearing? The idea being that the peasantry, small-holding farmers, are supposed to turn into industrial workers, and that's what fuels the development of capitalism. So this idea that in order for development to happen and capitalism to happen, your peasantry has to disappear, that continues to become extremely central to ideas of modernization, including capitalist modernization and development all over the world throughout the 20th century. And it becomes extremely important again in China during the market reforms after Mao's died. And it's become incredibly important in recent decades in particular, as China's trying to develop. Of course, they have this, or had, and to an extent still have, one of the largest peasantries or populations of rural smallholders any country anywhere has ever had, hundreds of millions of rural villages. So to develop, the idea has been in recent decades, we have to build lots and lots of basically urban houses, urban homes. We have to urbanize, we have to build towns, we have to build cities, cities, cities. And what they have now is almost the reverse of the original urban question. Tens of millions, some people put the number at around 65 million, empty urban homes, and still a very large population of rural smallholders. And while there has been a huge amount of urbanization, they're finding, policymakers are now finding that actually people are not moving off their rural land in the way that was kind of expected. And a lot of people don't want to, and there are an awful lot of obstacles to that happening. And this is a central question that Chinese policymakers are currently dealing with. So as part of that central urbanization drive in recent decades, what emerged and what has kind of led to the situation we're in now was what is talked about as a land-based accumulation model of development, which involves the conversion of rural land to urban land. Yimin, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Based on your understanding, could you talk us through how China's land-based accumulation model, well, how it emerged, how it works, and a lot of people say that now it seems to have come to an end. Do you think that's right? And how did that happen? Thank you.
All right. I'm a bit unsure about the background of our audience members today. So perhaps for some of you, if you are China experts, what I'm going to share may be too introductory. But I'm trying to start with some basic information to pave the way for further discussion. So basically, if we are going to reflect on urbanization, what does it mean? If we are going to do a quantitative analysis, that means the expansion of the urban space, that means the concentration of population in cities. So in the case of China, both happened. That means for each and every urban government, they have to prepare for such expansion. And basically, there are two directions to do this. One is to redevelop the inner city, to increase the density of the inner city. And the other one, more significant in terms of the scale, is to expand the urban boundary. So that's why for each and every Chinese city, if we are going to see now, you can find at least one new district, or new town, or new city. And many of them are turned into ghost cities or ghost towns in the past few years. So there are, in general, about 3 steps to do this urban project for the local government. The first one is to do local land banking, which means they have to try to get rid of the previous communities, settlements, people, urban functions or rural functions on that land, to make it blank, to make it ready for some new functions, make it ready for, from the view of the government officials, more advanced, developed, fancy, modern things to happen. And the political economic mechanism for this is land banking, because as many of you already know, the urban land in China is all owned by the state. So they have a lot of legal and institutional supports to do this land banking, but I'm not going into the detail of the mechanism of land banking here. And after land banking, the second step is to make land transactions. That's actually in the so-called second tier land market, the local government, they take use of the land storage, and then they sell the land plots in sometimes quite big, sometimes quite small plots to the developers. And then the third step is to reinvest, because now, according to a lot of statistics numbers, about half of Chinese local government's revenues are from land, half of all the local government's financial revenues. And they are taking use of such revenues not to enjoy life. They are going to reinvest. They are going to invest in large-scale infrastructures to prepare for further expansion of the urban space. So basically, that's the spatial and political economic mechanism of this land-based accumulation. And there are some further implications to talk about. The first one is, so in this process, to take advantage of such land banking or land-based accumulation mechanism, a precondition is to remove the previous settlements and users of the space. That means displacement and dispossession. So in this process, we can see that the commodification of land is preconditioned by the dispossession of people. And this is where we can engage with what David Harvey would call accumulation by dispossession. This is the first implication. And the second one, I would say more interesting, the China case, is about the role of the state. So when David Harvey was talking about accumulation by dispossession in the traditional capitalist context, the role of the state is secondary. But in China, the state is taking the lead of everything. The land banking system, the land transactions, the infrastructure investments. So basically, the whole land market was created by the Chinese state since the 1980s in China. So here we can even go further to ask if urbanism in China is not just a way of life, but also and more so a state project. In one of co-authored papers with him, we talk about this. So in this urbanism as a state project, we can see at least two critical dimensions to support this state-led land-based accumulation. One is an ideological one. That means there is a certain imagination of being urban in China, invented by the state and shared with people. And a majority of Chinese people would buy this idea, would agree with the state that there is a certain way to urbanize ourselves, our societies. And there is also a belief that urbanization is a necessary method or approach towards modernization. So this is an ideological construct associated and supporting urbanism as a state project. And furthermore, there is another dimension, the institutional. So here I want to cite Yimin Zhao's book. She's an expert talking about China's urban transformation. One key conclusion from her research is, in China, the local state has been urbanized, the urbanization of the local state. Here is a quote from her. So in her book, she said, the local state builds its territorial authority and finds its political identity in urban modernity. Hence, the local state is built and can be unbuilt by urban projects on physical, economic, political, and ideological fronts. And the result is interconnected physical, territorial, and ideological construction of urbanism. So this is why, from both the ideological and institutional perspective, I would argue or suggest that urbanism in China is more like a state project, not just a way of life. And the third implication here, and perhaps related to the recent downturn of this model, is about the scalar tensions, scalar politics between the different concerns of the central government and the local states. When we say that the local state has been urbanized, there is another dimension, the central government. They want to hold a more balanced view, especially they want to keep stability. So they would like to take advantage of this urban-oriented land-based accumulation, but on the other hand, to avoid risks induced by this accumulation. For example, the risks of spatial and regional unevenness, the risk of big city disease, especially in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, the so-called first-tier cities. And also the risk of housing price skyrocketing is, from the view of the central government, it might be too high for a lot of ordinary people. And also they are concerned about the sharp increase of local debts. So because of these concerns of the risks, they would like to do something to make sure that the pace of that land-based accumulation could be controlled. And this is the starting point of the policy since 2018 called 房住不炒. Housing is for use, for living, not for speculation. This is a quote from President Xi Jinping himself. 房子是用来住的，不是用来炒的. Abbreviation is 房住不炒. So the question is, how can we sustain a version of speculative urbanism without speculation? This, I think, is one of the reasons of the Chinese economic downturn since 2019, especially when we are talking about the urban side of this downturn. I think I can stop here.
Great, that was great. Thank you very much, Yimin. Hyun, I'm coming to you next. So Chinese policymakers, having based their hopes for development on urbanization, they began promoting a particular planned arrangement of cities nationwide, and that's sometimes called the tiered city system. Could you explain to us, do you think, what that is? What's the reasoning behind it? And what do you see as some of the problems with it?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. It's great to be here, sharing the thoughts with other panel members and the audience. Where Yimin was just now mentioning tier 1 cities like Beijing, Shanghai. So, I mean, you may hear when you read any newspapers, various articles about Chinese cities, it often refers to this kind of expression, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. I use it in my teaching as well when it comes to speaking to students. It's an unofficial designation. The more official use of the more official system used by Chinese government will be more referring to the political status of these cities. So it's provincial level cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, and Chongqing, or prefecture level cities, or sub-provincial city, prefecture level city, and sub-provincial city, which is like Shenzhen, and which is kind of slightly above the prefecture level, but below the province, or county level city. So these are the kind of more official designations. Whereas in kind of everyday discourse and also in the media and various kind of policy consultancy papers and so on, you will come across with tier 1, tier 2 much more frequently. And basically these are kind of in a sense kind of recent creations to classify various Chinese cities into either 4 groups or 6 different groups, depending on who is doing the classification, using some criteria such as the size of the population, whether you have more than 15 million population, or 3 million, or 150,000, or lower than smaller than 150,000, and so on. And also the political status, which I was just mentioning, in the provincial, prefecture, and so on and so forth. And then where the level of economic development, usually measured by the regional GDP. So if you are richer, then you get higher scores, and then you kind of put them together to produce kind of index and divide them into where this is tier 1, referring mostly to Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. And then you have tier 2, mostly including like cities like Tianjin, Chongqing, Lanzhou, and so on. So you can kind of see interesting in Chongqing and Shenzhen, for example. Sorry, I think tier 1 is Shenzhen, not Guangzhou. So Chongqing, for example, and Tianjin, which are provincial level cities, so they are very powerful in terms of their political status. But in a sense, they are grouped below tier 1. So you can kind of see the kind of differentiation between tier systems and the political status-based kind of systems of classifying in Chinese cities. So you get to see all of these tiered cities in the groupings. So tier 1 usually 4, tier 2 about 30, and tier 3 was I think 70 or so like that. So that's something you get to see a lot. So when you come across with the consultancy reports, they will use tier 1, tier 2 kind of designation as a way of showing various kind of outcomes of development and so on. I download a lot, and sometimes you use the consultant kind of reports on real estate development, and they often use tier 1, tier 2 as well for this kind of analysis. So it's a kind of system analyst open use, and that can be quite interesting. Now, when it comes to problems, well, such tier systems are very much kind of, I would probably say, the manifestation of uneven development in the first instance, and also probably a manifestation of how certain cities were able to develop much more quickly during the time of economic reform. And therefore, when you kind of hear the names of Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Chongqing, and so on, I mean, these are the front runners of the cities who are benefiting hugely from the 1990s and early 2000 kind of economic development, which were largely centered on major cities, especially in the eastern provincial eastern region of China. So in a sense, they are manifestation of such uneven development. But this is also acting in a certain way that kind of creates more opportunities for top-tier cities, and also much less opportunities for low-tier cities. And once you are seen to be in tier 3, tier 4, in a similar way, many league tables operate like university ranking systems. or the global cities index, and you get to kind of see like, when you're investors, you want to be in places where your investments can be more secured. So the problem is the lower ranking that you go down, and the more likely you are going to have heavier risk of investment in any case. So that's a problem already. And then there's the kind of issue of where you may hear, and I think Yimin was also alluding to, and this kind of change of direction in terms of governmental policy, where especially during the last 10 years or so, there's great emphasis on developing these smaller cities, because of the problems having accumulated over time, and therefore more attention given to basically low-tier cities, and also the kind of new urbanization countryside being very much kind of driving forward to turn countryside into cities, right? So that's all fine, but then you get to have this kind of problems of how these cities, which are in lower rankings, lower tiers, are often driven to mimic the experience of more advanced cities, more developed cities. So it's like kind of Beijing, Shanghai style kind of development, this land-based accumulation that was very much driving the growth of many of these cities. It's also being basically the model for low-tier cities as well, even though the circumstances within which such development of Beijing, Shanghai happened were not quite the same, as of now. So the problem is, you are actually encouraging a model of development that was successful in certain time periods under certain conditions of politics, economics, and geopolitics, being kind of presented as a model, or also being being the kind of aspiration of many of these cities, because they knew those are successful in the past, and they might consider adopting these for their own success as well. As you can see, land-based accumulation being one issue, and also a lot of emphasis on housing development being another. And we also get to understand a lot of these stories nowadays, how these real estate industries are very much vulnerable. Land-based accumulation also very much creating problems as well. So at the end of the day, you get to see many of these lower-tier cities who are trying to mimic the experience of development of many advanced cities in China, getting to have more deepening vulnerabilities. So when economic crisis loom large, then they are much more vulnerable, and that's exactly the problem that we have. And we have, and I just to cite one example, I'll probably stop there. You have to give me a sign to stop.
Oh no, you're good. You can stop around now, but
sure. Just one example in that case. So you have Chinese real estate developers who are very much dominant in the world stage, and one of them is Country Garden, which is one of the cases Yimin and I were looking at together in a British academic project. Country Garden is by far the largest in terms of sales area, sales revenues in China. Until like 2021, 22. They're also going through some difficulties nowadays, but then Country Garden has been basically investing a lot and operating a lot in tier 3, tier 4 cities. That's how they were able to expand. If a group like Country Garden goes bankrupt or goes down, you're basically looking at a huge amount of housing assets which are accumulating in tier 3, tier 4 cities, basically becoming subject to a lot of economic vulnerabilities, right? And that's not going to have a very, the same kind of implication as you might expect in tier 1 cities. For regions we can maybe revisit later if you have time. So I'll stop there and hand over to the next person.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bill, you published an article in 2015 with Christian Sarace in which you used the term, sorry, I think it came out originally online in 2015, maybe, with Christian Sarace, in which he used the term phantom urbanization. Can you explain what you mean by that term, and perhaps reflect on the term from the perspective of China today?
I'm a bit surprised by the specificity of that question. I would have thought we'd have more general discussion. Let me start by answering that with a general comment, which is that China's urbanization is unique in one important respect, and that is macro-historical timing. If we think about urbanization in the European context, it happens hand in glove with the Industrial Revolution, at the moment, in other words, of industrialization, right? All the classic story, people driven off the land by enclosures, come into the city in floods to take up jobs in the burgeoning mills. right? And this is a very well-worn pattern, not just in this country, but throughout at least the western part of Europe. And that's what we always think of, I think, in social science, in the back of our minds as what urbanization normally, quote unquote, is, or has been the paradigmatic experience, at least, of urbanization. If we, though, then think about urbanization in the 20th century, in places like Latin America, much of Africa, much of Southeast Asia, much of South Asia, it happens in the absence of or before significant industrialization, right? People leave the land, they flood into cities, but there is no industry there for them to move to, right? There are no jobs for them to take up. This is then the creation and proliferation of what we now know as slums, shanty towns, informal urbanization, et cetera, that happens all over the world, kind of in this moment of roughly the post-Second World War instance up until the latter decades of the 20th century, so 1940 to 1980, let's say broadly. In China, what we're seeing is something unique, which is urbanization at the moment of deindustrialization, rather than industrialization or before industrialization. And that timing, I think, is quite important and really needs to prefigure all of the subsequent discussion. So urbanization, if it's happening after the jobs have left, rather than before they've come or right as they're coming, will have different implications. And if you want to talk about phantom urbanization, ghost cities, et cetera, in that article, we identified two basic patterns, and I'm going to add a third, and I'll just talk through what those are. So the first pattern that we identified were the sort of boom towns where no one shows up, right? So the case we used for this was Kambashi in the central to western part of Inner Mongolia, in the municipality of Ordos. And this was a place that was the epicenter of a natural resource boom. Coal and several other minerals were discovered there in deposits richer than anywhere else known in China at that time. This is about 20 years ago that those were discovered. In the following years, the local government decided that the way to make best use of this newfound windfall was to plow it all into real estate development. And so they built a beautiful showcase city in the middle of the desert, and no one came. And then eventually they had to force local officials to move to the city, and slowly a few people have begun to populate it. But for years and years and years after it was built, this is a city larger than Manchester, a city meant for about 2.5 million people, which had no one living in it for more than 10 years after its construction. Literally almost no one. The only people there were construction workers and maintenance workers there to finish out the buildings that remained empty, right? And so there was a skateboarding film that took place there. I think there was a beauty pageant, perhaps owned by Donald Trump, that was hosted there at one point. But otherwise, no one went there. No one did anything with this. Tourists started going there to take photos of the empty scene and these beautiful buildings that had been constructed that were completely hollow. The second pattern, so that happened there, and that happened in some other places around China, particularly where there was sort of a natural resource windfall or other reason why suddenly there was a great deal of wealth. The second pattern we identified were these cities that had been created out of kind of whole cloth in what previously had been rural areas. And the case that we focused on in that article was a city in Sichuan called Yingxiu, I believe, that was rebuilt after the earthquake had destroyed what had been a small county town and rebuilt as a much larger city. But this was part and parcel of a general set of programs in the 2010s, really launched around 2011 as sort of a parting shot from Hu Jintao, called Changjiang Yitihua and then Nongcun Changjianhua programs. And those two programs were meant at developing cities in the countryside in order, allegedly, to bring jobs, growth, and wealth to rural areas and to promote higher rates of consumption in the domestic political economy. All very laudable, except they built a city, they moved the farmers off the land and into the city, and there were no jobs. And because there were no jobs, many of those same people actually had then to migrate out to look for jobs in existing larger cities as migrant workers to earn the cash necessary to pay the mortgages on housing that they never wanted and didn't need and couldn't use. And so this became a sort of hollowing out of what had been a rural setting through its own urbanization. And so that's a second pattern that we identified. There's a third pattern that I want to at least mention that we didn't talk about in that article, but that I think is extremely important in some other parts of the country. So I'll mention this based on one city where I spent time more than 20 years ago, about 25 years ago, which is the city of Benxi in Liaoning province. I hadn't been back there for a very long time, and I got to go back there in 2016, there and a couple of other places, Shenyang, and a couple other places around the Northeast. And it was very, very, very obvious what had happened. And it comported very nicely with what I've been reading in some of the academic literature published by Chinese colleagues in the intervening years, which is that in the 1990s and early 2000s, even before that, really go back to the 1980s, a great many state-owned enterprises, massive behemoths of state-owned enterprises across the Northeast, were hemorrhaging cash and losing jobs. Millions and millions of people were laid off. Whole districts of cities, whole cities, in the case of a place like Benxi, were essentially deindustrialized almost overnight, right? A great center of manufacturing and resource-intensive jobs that had employed tens of millions of people now was gone. And so how were these firms going to recover? And how were local people going to be able to make any kind of a livelihood? How could local governments actually help with this? And then, my first book, I detailed a lot of the issues around the reemployment service centers and welfare systems that they tried to set up. But what they finally hit upon that was actually somewhat successful, and you could see this very clearly even just walking around the cities 20 years later, was this process of taking the old factory and this large footprint that was there in the city and selling the land for real estate development and turning the firm into essentially a real estate development concern, right? And we see this again and again and again. Large state-owned enterprises opening up a real estate development arm in the 2000s and in the 2010s, making a lot of money off of that, using those profits to buy out, right, through Maidong Gongling and other kinds of arrangements, to buy out all of those laid-off workers and the retirees, and then to supposedly have the city be redeveloped with these gleaming new districts, right? The Tiexi in Shenyang is a famous example of this. Huge, beautiful, gleaming buildings and BMW dealerships and luxury goods stores all over the place. Walk there at night, it's all dark. Not a single person in those buildings for the most part. Almost all of it vacant. Many of those shops devoid of customers during the day, and more of them vacant altogether. Right? This is a kind of ghost city by redevelopment. And this model is not unique, I suspect, to the Northeast, but it is particularly visible there and has been noticed, not just by me, but by many, many colleagues in China and beyond. And so this third pattern of sort of ghostly development or phantom urbanization is the redevelopment of brownfield industrial sites into ghost districts. That end up being just as uneconomical as the SOEs that have preceded them, again, because essentially a city's been created with no jobs to follow, or where jobs have already disappeared. And do I still have time, or should I stop there?
Well, fun.
Stop?
Yeah, thank you very much. Olivia, coming to you now. You've worked a lot on Xi Jinping thought. How do you think the urbanization drive fits in with his development plans more generally?
So I think there are many ways to tackle this. Perhaps I will talk about Xi Jinping's anti-poverty campaign that might provide another angle to think about urbanization. So that would very much actually echo what we have heard just now, that urbanization is very much a state-led project, transforming lives of a lot of people and transforming land, and almost happened overnight. The anti-poverty campaign in China under Xi Jinping was launched between 2015 to 2020. So Xi Jinping announced the campaign. He said at the beginning that this is about lifting China's rural population out of absolute poverty. So I believe he defined absolute poverty at that time to be 4,000 yuan, Chinese yuan per capita as an annual per capita income rate, 4,000 yuan, which works out to be around $600. So it's a rather low indigenous Chinese absolute poverty threshold for the rural region. And he has this, ambition announced in 2015 of lifting 70 million of China's rural residents living under, this rural poverty line out of poverty. And that would mean that they need to have a per capita income above, the poverty line that I just mentioned. And he called that figuratively the two no worries. Like as if you meet that level, then you don't need to worry about clothes, you don't need to worry about food. And in addition to that, he also have another slogan called the free guarantees, which is that you are guaranteed to live in a safe accommodation, so a safe shelter. You're guaranteed basic access to medical care, and your children are also guaranteed, access to compulsory education. So this is the package of his anti-poverty drive. And the reason why I mention it is the conclusion that the local Chinese government reached after Xi Jinping made all these grand announcements is that for 10 million out of 70 million people, the most important thing to do to lift them out of poverty is to move them away from the rural areas that they are living in. So the local government there take the opinion that there are 10 million people who are being trapped in poverty because of the environment. They're living in houses that are not, they're living in ecologically unsafe environment. They are too far away from, major towns, so they are inaccessible to, public amenities and so on. So the best thing to do is to take these people out, because changing the environment is too much of a job. And a lot of those are ecological areas or areas prone to, earthquake and so on. So moving the people out is the way to go. So the term that time is poverty alleviation through relocation. And that ties in really neatly with what we have been saying, the expansion of urban areas. So there are various ways of how it has been done. One of the ways is that there are major resettlement zones. They are apartment buildings that are built at the outskirts of cities. So definitely not the first, second tier cities. So cities that are don't have a large population to begin with. And in the outskirts of those cities, there are major, rehousing zones, and they are for people who have been moved out from those rural areas designated for relocation. And next to those areas, quite often, the government would also build industrial parks, and they are like factories for low-skilled manufacturing, where provinces in the east of China, they are wealthier, they are paired with provinces in the west and central region, and they are encouraged through government mobilization to run those industrial parks, where they would hire people who have been relocated and living in those new apartment blocks to work in those factories. So it was designed to be a very a very nice arrangement, everything being taken care for you. And your farmland in rural area, the local government also arranged for that to be collectively contracted out to commercial, big commercial agri-farmers. So that was the ideal that model that has been implemented, but the actual implementation is very, very, very mixed. A lot of variations, but the vision nonetheless is that that ideal on how good modernization could look like and how that can be a means to take people out of poverty. So eventually, at the end of the anti-poverty campaign, it was announced that 9.6 million people were successfully relocated. And when you think about the scale, I mean, it is just quite difficult to grasp that. 9.6 million people relocated within 4 years, and most of them to apartments that are purposefully built just for this anti-poverty campaign. So it's a massive effort. But then obviously, if you talk about how sustainable it is, are those people still holding on to a job? Those apartments that they live in, to what is it paid for them? Do they need to take out a mortgage? Are they paying back successfully? Then you are getting into the details, getting a lot trickier and a lot of variation and a lot of contention over there. So that's the big picture I'm talking about. But to go back to what Jane, you said, so anti-poverty was very central to Xi. He saw this as the indicator to symbolize the completion of his goal of building a moderately prosperous society, that China successfully gotten rid of, rural absolute poverty, according to his definition of what that poverty is. And it also shows the people that the Chinese government is willing to invest in their well-being. So in the book that I completed with my colleague Steve Zhang, we are saying that the overall picture to look at this is that Xi Jinping is putting forward what we describe as a new de facto social contract. The idea being that he is expecting the Chinese people to rally around the party a lot more tightly, including accepting a lot of tighter social control, and also accepting that they should be supporting the party, even if the economy doesn't go that well. While in exchange, there is a promise that the government would provide more for them and meet their high expectations where possible. So the anti-poverty campaign is a very dramatic way to demonstrate this new de facto social contract. But you can also make the argument that this contract is something that is very hard to maintain, and because it very much depends on the government's ability to provide and to sustain that momentum. So with China's economy facing many challenges, that would have a direct impact on the level of provision that can be sustained going forward.
Thank you very much. So final question, and it's the same question for all of you, and I'll ask you to, if possible, keep to 5 minutes, because then we can finish by 8 and have audience questions.
5 minutes total.
No, 5 minutes each.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. If we take, and we'll go in the same order, I think. If we take China's urban question to be the obstacles Chinese policymakers are currently facing on their proposed transition from an agrarian society to a society based as much as possible on urban middle-class living, what do you see as the biggest obstacle they're facing today? And what steps might you suggest that they take to resolve it? And do you think they'll be able to? Yimin, go ahead.
Thank you. So I think I have two concerns that I can share here. One is with regard to the unresolved tension in and with the logic of control regarding the manner of governance in China. Here, so there is another urban scholar, Fu Longwu, who has long been talking about the state entrepreneurialism in China. And I would say there is a even more straightforward way to talk about this. That is to see how market has been constructed as a part of the state apparatus in China, while there is still some logics of capital or markets that are running outside of the control of the state. So basically, this is the tension. The market is constructed by the state, but the state can never fully control the market. So the tension is lying here. I'm saying this because I can see a never achieved balance between this market operation and the state regulation. For example, in the 2000s, when the real estate market in China was just starting to rise, there were a series of ordinances from State Council trying to take control of the scale of speculation. There are various 国8条, 国10条, different versions of the ordinance from the State Council to stop. But many of the speculators, many of the local people, the everyday speculators, they take such ordinances as like signals for further expectation of higher housing price.
Mm.
So this is how the first, in my view, the first wave of boom is partly co-created by the market mechanisms and partly by the state regulations. And even a lot of SOE, state-owned enterprises, as Bill just shared with us, they were also involved in the speculation of housing, property development, such as Zhonghua and many others. And then in the 2010s, in the middle of 2010s, about 10 years ago, there is another very big state-led project called the Shantytown renovation, 棚户区改造. So from 2015 to 2018, in about 4 years, there were more than 6 million households were demolished, their houses were demolished in shantytown areas. A majority of them in the 3rd or 4th tier cities in China, the much smaller ones, including those industrial post-industrial cities. And then this whole shantytown renovation project was delivered in a financialized way. Basically, the households that get monetary compensation, they are encouraged to buy their new flats in the markets. So this is the biggest opportunity for Chinese property developers like Country Garden Group to expand their business in those third and fourth tier cities. It's not a coincidence that between 2015 and 2018 is the period when the housing price in China rose quickest. It's the peak time of Chinese housing price. So here again, government and the market, the two logics, they're interwoven with each other, and there is always a state concern to control the market logic, but to take use of the market, but it's never achieved the balance. And now,
can I
yeah.
Thank you. Can I move on to Hyun?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Maybe I have a few things to say, but I try to keep the 5 minutes. But as a start, it will be still useful to think of two things first, and then I elaborate a little more. Middle class, I mean, I'm sure many here would also already understand, but it will be probably still useful to reiterate. Middle class doesn't mean the middle section of the population, really. It's the high income people. So when you actually look at the kind of in the Chinese kind of media reports, during the early 2000s, it was kind of referring to the income range, which actually produced. And I was kind of doing a quick calculation a few years ago. In 2007, for example, based on the income range, that many reports were referring to based on governmental kind of discussions, think tank discussions. It was actually basically we are actually looking at the top 20% of the income group when it comes to middle class. So I think we shouldn't be confused about what middle class is actually referring to. So that's probably one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is about why middle class is so important for China, and I think we get to hear a lot of stories about the importance of expanding the middle class, and I think this is also important for us to think about where the Chinese economy is moving to. And if you kind of think, consider Chinese economy having developed so much on investing in infrastructure and so on, building cities and infrastructure, a lot of production, manufacturing, and so on. While that used to be a major driver of economic development, raising GDP and so on, there's a government increasingly coming to realize, but that can't be the only kind of driver anymore, and therefore you need to have a bit more consumption basis in order to produce kind of two pillar systems: one production, another consumption, as a way of sustaining a bit more stable economic development. And this is where middle class questions kick in. There's a consumption base that needs to expand, and basically middle class was seen to be the solution to this. And therefore you get to see how various measures can be produced to expand the middle class. So that's probably, I think we need to kind of set that at the start of the conversations. So middle classes used to be about 13% of the national population by about 2002, according to the McKinsey report. About 40% of them used to live in tier 1 cities. So you get to have that kind of situation of a huge concentration of very rich people in tier 1 cities, right? And the question was how to expand this base even more when you go down the tiers of city systems. Yeah. Now, I think this is where we get to hear about let me kind of throw these three questions in as a way of provoking more thoughts. So one is when you hear about the housing-based development or land-based accumulation, but also a lot of investment goes into residential property building, but that also means people are buying these properties. I mean, of course, ghost towns and so on, but these ghost towns are not are not towns without any ownership. They are still owned by some people. They just remain empty. Which also means, basically, there's a lot of emphasis on households, basically putting their money into housing. So some reports will refer to various figures, but you can probably safely say the majority of people's wealth asset would have been tied to housing. So when you kind of look at this situation, and also with the thinking of the kind of ongoing kind of real estate problems that China has been facing increasingly nowadays. You get to see this, and what does this mean for the middle classes? They were really expanding their wealth spaces by putting their money into housing. And there's a lot of people probably feeling very worried about this. And the more you go down low tiers, the more people are going to be worried because that can be their major source. That also takes us to this social contract Olivia was referring to just now, because the kind of interesting thing about East Asian development is because the development of South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China as well, during the time of very rapid development, the development was very much seeing the support of the state, and they're also coming together with the growth of the emergence and the expansion of the middle classes. What the economic development was able to realize was the kind of improvement of the wealth conditions for these expanding middle classes who are nurtured by the state. So they are not, by definition, against the state per se. They are basically endorsing the power of the state because the state was basically what was enabling them to become more affluent. And then I think becomes also the basis of some degree of social contract, where we get to see middle classes in China not very much like in the presidency is bad or in the Chinese government is bad, but they are actually seeing the benefit of having such strong leadership and governments who are actually supporting them. And now the material basis becoming much more weak and vulnerable. Now the question is, would that kind of support for the government and for the state would that continue among the middle classes? So I guess that's where I'll probably stop and
yeah, great, thank you, Bill.
I guess I'll just sort of comment generally on a few issues of this. The first is this basic proposition, basic issue, basic contradiction between the state and the market, right? I think this is really not unique to China. We can go back at least to Polanyi and think about how it is in fact the state that creates the national market, and without the national market, we don't have a modern state. And the whole concept of double movement, of creating more efficient markets and then having to intervene in order to correct some of the distortions and negative social effects of those markets is indeed a very old story, right? I mean, laissez-faire was planned, planning was not, right? They have to keep coming back in this kind of ad hoc way. And I think China is facing that maybe more acutely than a lot of other countries have, if for no other reason than the state has played such a heavy-handed role in creating the market, but also because it's all happened so fast. Similarly to a lot of other processes, what's happened in China over the last, say, 60 years took several hundred years in many of these other contexts that are more familiar from the theory literature. The second thing that I'll mention very quickly is, what was the break on urbanization? Right? Urbanization didn't happen until this moment of deindustrialization, largely because of a particular facet of Chinese political system that interestingly hasn't been mentioned once by any of us, is the hukou system, right? And for decades, hukou system reform has been mooted, but never carried out. But there is one caveat to that. It was actually carried out to some extent in certain municipalities in Guangdong province. And it's actually a fairly old story, at least 10 years. And what's interesting about it, though, is that the uptake was very low. When actually offered the opportunity to acquire a local urban hukou in that locality, many of the migrants who had come in from the countryside refused. And they refused for a very simple reason. Without the agricultural hukou in their original native place, they would lose their right to land. Why is that still so important, that land-based economy of the migrant worker? I mean, I've made the argument a long time ago, actually, based on another idea from Polanyi, that essentially the land wealth and therefore calorie floor provided to migrant workers' families because of their agricultural hukou actually represented a kind of aid in wages, right? That allowed them to accept wages in the city that were so low that you couldn't actually feed your family off of that. And that then allows laid off workers to be outcompeted by migrant workers in the early 2000s. But it would appear that even much more recently, in places like Zhongshan, that went some of the furthest, or went perhaps the furthest with this kind of hukou reform, migrants there still felt insecure working in the city and earning money without that baseline guarantee of land for subsistence back in their home village, which in some cases they hadn't even been able to get back to for years. They themselves were not even working on the land, but they still felt it was necessary to have that. How am I doing for time? Do I still have a moment?
1 minute, yeah.
In 1 minute remaining, I guess I would say just very quickly that in terms of addressing this issue, what can the Chinese government do? I think the basic bet will be, as it has been now, that China can grow fast enough and long enough such that the various problems and distortions become small enough relative to the overall size of the economy that they don't have to worry about them anymore. The kind of process that was described very well in the 1980s as growing out of the plan, right? That many segments of the economy just grew beyond what the planned economy could deal with. And therefore the problems of the planned economy sort of faded to the background a bit. I think that's the bet, because anything else is either too risky in political terms or not effective in economic or social terms.
Thank you. Olivia.
All right, so your question is, what are the obstacles facing urbanization going forward, is it?
And what should they do about it, do you think?
Right. So I'll keep my response really brief. I heard really fascinating things from all of you, which I'm processing quite quickly. So I study a lot, like what Jane said, like Xi Jinping's thinking. Like basically what I did was I read his speeches. I tried to read as much as possible. For the governance of China, like 治国理政, like I know that really well, perhaps too well. I read it many times, and I read, you know, official government documents and papers, especially if Xi Jinping's name is on it, if he is described as the author, I pay a lot of attention to that. I classified what I read, I highlight them, I analyze them. So I have basically been following the leader very closely for the past 10 years. So from what I can see is that like urbanization and tackling the problems associated with it in and of itself is not his top priority. I mean, I described that in the context of the social contract just now, but another really relevant frame to look at it is really China's whole economic reform and the shift in economic paradigm that is undergoing in China today. Xi Jinping had 3 economic goals in order of importance. They're economic strength, economic order and security, and after that, common prosperity. And urbanization is being fit by him somewhere between the second and the third goal. It's not up there. So economic strength, we are really talking about technological innovation, you know, like outcompeting the United States and China having independent, innovative ability in critical and advanced technology. This to him is the top economic goal because it is tied directly to the second goal, which is on economic security, you know, de-risking, decoupling. And when he thinks about economic order, he sees it very heavily in terms of deleveraging, you know, controlling unsustainable debt. And hence we see what is happening with China's property market. And finally, there's common prosperity, which means improving the livelihood of the poor people in China, which there are a lot of them. So improving their livelihood gradually, and anti-poverty campaign as a boost to show that he's committed to that. But after that, you don't see that kind of, you know, intensive mobilization, you know, a 4-year period, I need to reach, you know, ambitious goals. He has passed that phase. Now it is down to, you know, like long-term policy changes for, you know, poor people in China to, you know, climb up the ladder. So urbanization somewhat fit between his second and third goal, and it's definitely not his top priority. And I think we can see quite clearly in how the allocation of funds, I mean, you see a lot of new government funds at all levels for innovation keep on coming out, and new schemes, new initiatives, you know, creative ways to, you know, promote the agenda. For urbanization, there's definitely a lack of policy creativity that could have had been more. And I think one possible explanation is that it is simply not the top of his mind when it comes to, you know, making China's economy good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone, Shefali? Great. So there's a microphone going round. Yeah, do you want to start us off? Thanks.
Hello, I'm Francis. I study international relations here at King's College London, and I'm working with the UNDP. My question concerns the future, the projection of China's future. All of the panelists, and I think maybe including the moderator, you have mentioned how the Chinese central government has a rather heavy-handed presence when it comes to China and other societies, other societies in the world. So I'm thinking about whether we can see a pattern in the future Chinese development, or do you think maybe if the government decides to take a rather arbitrary way, the pattern can be shifted quite differently? Thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to take that?
I can.
Go ahead.
I want to start with a press conference held 15 hours ago in China by State Council today. So in that press conference, some new policies were announced, like another 1 million households in other villages in China will be demolished in the next couple of months. And you'll see the return of the shantytown renovation agenda. And also a much bigger expansion of the so-called white list policy for property developers. It's like a relaxing of the financial control. So policies like this are quite familiar. Seems like the government now realize the difficulties, the challenges. They're trying to take use of the old wine in the new bottle to deal with the new problems. But the problem for me from today, perhaps we can try to speculate on the future. The concern I have is, given this already never achieved balance I just talked about, what will happen if this round of rescue failed? If 1 million households demolition does not work, then what will be next? Perhaps this is something maybe Polanyi cannot explain, because in my view, my speculation is even further, much stricter political control will come back.
Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah.
Sure. Let me say two things. First, on this immediate point, I have not seen that news conference yet. I was traveling earlier today down from Cambridge. I'll be sure to take a look at that. But it appears very much of a piece with the overall program of economic stimulus over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and essentially an attempt again to get the economy to grow such that it will grow far enough, fast enough that all of these problems and distortions will eventually become sort of minimal importance. In terms of Polanyi, I actually would not turn to Polanyi on this, I would turn to Keynes. This looks like the classic example of dig a ditch and fill it in again, right? Demolish 1 million houses and build 1 million new ones. Oh, that'll start the economy, right? I mean, it sounds like that's basically the thinking, and I suspect very much that it is. If we think about the government being heavy-handed, the ultimate example of that to me is how all this urbanization happened in the 2010s. The government simply waved its hand and said 450 million people who yesterday were rural are now urban because we changed their classification on the hukou. Did they move? Did they change their? No. But now magically they're urban. That is the ultimate heavy-handed government intervention. And it was intended very specifically to alleviate poverty and increase consumption. But as I've argued and would continue to argue, that's probably not the most expedient, efficient, or equitable way to accomplish those goals. And I'm not sure that there is another way that the Chinese government would be capable actually of doing that. I'm not sure if it's a matter of creativity as much as it's a matter of institutional constraint and sort of the degree to which the behavior of China's government institutions and other institutions of social and economic control is conditioned by their very structure. And I'm not sure they have many other ways out. And so in terms of looking into the future, I mean, Xi Jinping has been talking for years about a new normal of lower growth. And I think we're there. And the question is really only, there's a twofold question. First, can even lower growth be maintained? You know, and in other words, you know, can it be maintained with any growth at all, or are we going to go negative and stay negative for some period of time, a longer term recession? And secondly, is that sufficient? Right? There's been talking around this idea of positive power and mass line and getting, you know, people to rally around the party and support the party despite lower growth. Is slower growth sufficient? Or do we still need a kind of performance legitimacy that Zhao Dingxin and others used to point to back in the 1980s and 1990s? I don't know. I don't know the answer to these things. I don't know if China will grow fast enough to alleviate these problems. I don't know if slower growth is attainable versus negative, and I don't know if it's sufficient to buy legitimacy or to forestall a loss of legitimacy in the political arena for the Chinese government and leadership. I hope China does reasonably well, but I don't know. I don't think anybody does.
Thank you. Olivia or Hyun, do you want to come in on that at all?
I'll give you the pass.
Okay, sure. Any other questions? Oh, lots of questions. Okay. Let me take 3 on this side then, and then we'll come to this side of the next round. Go if we have time, which I hope we will. Yes, go ahead. There's 3 right here.
Hi, I'm Zhi Wei from UCL Department of Geography. I'm a PhD student in human geography, and thanks for your very fascinating talking. My question, although today we are talking about China's urban question, but my question is about the rural area. So since 2020, the Chinese central government has implemented a so-called rural revitalization, and recently we have kind of urbanization in the county area. My question is that, do you think it could be a possible way to release the productivity, a potential productivity in the urban area? And do you think it could stimulate a new round of speculation? Thank you.
Okay. This guy too, thanks.
I'm Maurizio Marinelli from UCL. I would like to thank the speakers. However, I didn't hear a word that I think is the crux of the urban question in any country. And of course, in China, it assumes particular connotation. The word is value. When we talk about land, the exchange value vis-a-vis the use value. When we talk about living in the city, the value, the added value of living in a city. When we were talking about livelihood, and you know the value basically, and I wonder, you know, what are your insights in terms of this discourse of value in relation also to the discourse of the state and capital, of course.
Thank you. And one right here too.
Thank you. Yeah, Charlotte Gibbon from the Lautan Institute. So fascinating discussion of the role of the state in urbanization in China. It seems to be the dominant theme here, that it is a state project. And it's not that I'm not convinced of that, but of course, at the same time, there is also spontaneous urbanization happening, not least through really large scale migration. Hukou system obviously constrains that to some extent. Although I do wonder if people will be more happy to give up their land and take urban hukou if they were guaranteed urban levels of welfare of the large city kind of variety, not the 4th tier cities where nobody actually wants to settle, but that's probably a separate question. I guess what I'm really interested in knowing your views on then is, to what extent is spontaneous urbanization going to contribute to solving China's urban question?
Thank you. Okay, so we have 3, one on rural revitalization, one on value, one on spontaneous urbanization.
Would you like to come on that actually, Jane? I know you've done a lot of research in those.
No, I'm chairing. No, you guys go ahead. Good. Any or all of those?
I want to suggest, Jane, you should set an example and be a speaker for once. Well, I probably need to digest all of these questions, and they are very important questions. So I really don't have an immediate answer or clear answer to this, to be honest. I mean, And I mean, we talked about in various ways of thinking about what urbanization entails, and it entails migration, but also entails the kind of what Bill was referring to, the kind of change of who could construct and or with people without moving actually becoming urban all of a sudden, and that's also part of that. But when it comes to productivity question that Jue from UCL was referring to, where I mean Chinese economy and regional development, when you kind of put them together, have always been kind of looking at, I mean, China, looking at how China can actually take the benefit of kind of the scale that the scale is an advantage, right? Geographical scale. I mean, it's a huge country, and therefore, in a similar way, other smaller countries are thinking of relocating their industries to other countries. China basically relocating their industries from one region of China to another. And that has been basically producing kind of variegated capitalisms within China, which is something like Jamie Peck, another geographer from British Columbia University of British Columbia in Canada, was reporting to. So you get to see that kind of situations in the kind of internal kind of relocation, taking the advantage of uneven development, and that also addressing some of the more the economic problems that China has been facing, or also a way of how the kind of geopolitical problems are somehow addressed by China's own internal mobilization resources and production capacities and so on and so forth, and also this kind of relocation of industries and so on. And I think this is probably going back to rural countryside and urbanization. It can be, I would probably say that it will be one of the ways in which China has been trying to address the problems. The lower growth rates that China has been experiencing can also be partly involving this kind of attention to the countryside and as a way of kind of pursuing the similar strategies. So solving the problems by means of taking this kind of internal kind of mobilization and what it means to think about various different factors of production and so on. I'll probably think about that in a question along that line and trying to think of how rural countryside development can fit into the overall economic development strategies China has been trying to pursue.
Bill, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly. First, on the question of urbanization or more intensive urbanization of county towns and similar places, and will that improve the productivity of urban areas? No, quite the opposite. In terms of value, and this question of use value, exchange value, et cetera, I've actually argued quite explicitly elsewhere, and I would still, that when it comes at least to housing and a lot of urban property, real property in urban areas in China, the use value has been almost entirely eclipsed by exchange value in those terms. So people are using housing and real property as a store of capital rather than as a asset that can actually be put to productive use or humane use. I mean, it's no longer a shelter as much as this is just a bank into which to put capital in the hopes that it may appreciate and it will be safer than A-share stocks or government bonds or bank savings with negative real interest, right? So this is, I think, a major distortion in the market is due to that. And it also creates very significant negative externalities for the urban population. When it comes to spontaneous urbanization, yes, absolutely. I see that happening all over the place. We go all the way back to the 90s and all these famous Zhejiang and so on in Beijing, all these things that were taking place at that time. But I would just mention very quickly, what about spontaneous rustication, right? And that's also something that we see again and again. So, I mean, 20 years ago, I saw this again in the Northeast of laid off workers leaving the city because of complete lack of jobs and livelihood and going to the countryside to work as farmhands because the countryside had been depopulated in many of those low population density to begin with. And a lot of the rural people had left to go work in the South and bigger cities, further away. And so people from those smaller industrial cities were going out to the countryside actually to work there. More recently, there's been all over the news. When I was in China last year, I saw this every day, a report on this on the TV news. Young people, middle class and upper class, very highly educated people, artists, creative people, moving to the countryside in order to live less expensively and do various kinds of remote work or creative endeavor in rural settings. I don't know quite how common that is, and I don't think it's a path to mass employment or solving all the problems that youth face when they can't get jobs commensurate with their education, which is a tremendous social problem in urban China that we haven't even talked about. But it maybe is something more important than we sometimes think, and maybe is of a greater scale than it is likely realized by people sitting here looking at China from a distance.
Thank you. Yimin or Olivia, do you want to come in on?
I can try to respond briefly. So first, respond to Zhiwei. In my view, rural revitalization is not about the rural. It's very quite obviously an extension of the land-based accumulation mechanism. It's where the rural space is being reproduced in an urban way, because many of the projects are for urban consumers by urban capital, has little to do with the local villages. And also another coincidence, but interesting thing, is the rise of the Xiangshen discourse now in China. The gentry discourse.
The gentry discourse.
Yes. So I think the two are linked with each other. And to Mauricio, your question reminds me of some researchers on Hong Kong, talking about Hong Kong people's property minds. And I'm thinking that maybe now for the majority of the speculators, the middle-class speculators in Chinese property market, they are also sharing this kind of property minds. So I agree with Bill that the exchange value is much more important when we are talking about the value in this urbanizing society. And then to respond to your question, two cases came into my mind regarding spontaneous urbanization. One is Xiaochanquan, small property development projects. In the case of Beijing, all of such projects are deemed illegal. And in the past 6 years, about 260 million square meters of such buildings were demolished in the past 6 years. Yeah, under the direct instruction from President Xi Jinping. So I don't think there is now enough space for such kind of spontaneous urbanization model to emerge. But on the other hand, there is another case recently, also some young people I saw from like Xiaohongshu. They moved to cities like Hegang, those post or deindustrialized cities with much lower housing price. You can buy a flat with just 2,000 pounds in that city. Yeah, that's very cheap. And many of the young people that moved there, they try to explore their new urban life in such cities. I don't know what will be the effects, but this could be a good case to talk about spontaneous urbanization.
Did you mean people move there from the countryside?
From much bigger cities.
Bigger cities.
Yeah, from Beijing or Shanghai or many other big cities. Yeah.
So I think I'll comment on the question of value. Like what made me, when you mentioned value, what I thought of immediately is a rural collective economy and how, the expansion of urban space or turning rural land, farmland into urban areas do not automatically create value. And quite often it is down to the local village leaders to do something about it, to make it, to increase productivity and so on. So the classic model that has happened in China is to, turn those land into factories, then like invite, businesses from the east of China and foreign to come to hire workers. And the workers are also people who are hukao holders of the village. So this is a model of, collective economy because they are all, turning in their land rights to the local government, and the local government, after centralizing the land rights, build factories on it, then invite, people to, operate the factories while hiring the locals as wage earners. While at the same time, the local government also give them some minimal, welfare provision. So they have a low salary, they have a welfare provision, and they live in dormitories or like simple accommodation in the urbanized area that was previously rural. So this is very much a form of collective economy. You might even call that recollectivization. And that would that come with varying level of increase of social control, but that is uneven across China. In one more extreme case, a village called Nanjie, which I visited in Henan province in central China, that was done to promote a socialist agenda. So, like singing red songs and, like worshiping Mao, like all tied together. Well, some villages do it, do not push that ideological line as hard and just really see it more as a model of organizing, economy and providing employment. So there are variations there. But like what I found interesting is in those cases, the local villagers themselves, they are actually quite often willing and grateful for a collective economic arrangement. So this is quite different from the image when you think about urbanization freedom, you're taking control of your life, you're finding your job. I mean, they are finding security and employment through a collective model of economic arrangement.
Thank you. I saw a couple of hands go up over here. Yeah, go ahead. Are there any more questions on this side? If not, we'll take this one too.
Hi, I'm Tianzi from Geography Department at King's. Thank you very much for the talk. So my question is really about Chinese urban question. So we see lots of the rise of unfinished homes across China in tier 1 cities and also in lower tier cities. So we often, like when we read on the news, like we blame for the developer for not having this pre-sale housing construction finished. So what would be the role of the central government and also local government in China in terms of solving this issue? And also, are there any like implications, towards future, I don't know, governments in terms of like housing market? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was just one more question over here, last one, I think. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. I'm Carwyn Morris from Leiden University. I thought I'd end by asking, are there any positive, different models, alternative models, something inspiring or different? It doesn't have to be led by the state. And I guess position maybe for a lower middle class person or something like that. Is there anything where they could go, this is a future, the cheapest city in China, or moving to Dali could be something for some people, but are there other things that you've seen which might inspire people? Thanks.
Thank you.
I can maybe have a go. The second question, and then I come back to Tianzi later. For Karin's question about this model, I mean, not a straightforward direct answer to that, but it's something I felt when I was writing this kind of in the book chapter upon invitation by a group of researchers who worked on Guangzhou, Pearl River Delta region, urbanized villages, and they were looking at the kind of were two different types of places, and one was the redevelopment of urbanized villages in Guangzhou, which was kind of emerging as a new practice from about 2008, where the urbanized villages were able to actually come together, working in partnership with developers and local government and supporting this, and making use of the shareholding company structure. There was part of the reform, basically being being the delivery mechanism for this redevelopment, which was also coming together with the local villages become basically very affluent the holders of the assets, which were the result of redevelopment on the basis of their the kind of membership in the shareholding company. Another area was in a city, in a neighborhood in Guangzhou, which was of heritage conservation. I was kind of approaching these two types of areas in my research. I was a little more skeptical and criticizing, but the editors were more kind of optimistic. So I was like, am I in the wrong place? So the tone of my chapter is very much different from the tone of the overall book. And I think it just basically, what I'm trying to say is, I think it depends on very much what kind of perspective you bring into. And this is what I always kind of see as dilemma when you kind of look at the urbanized villages in China, like in southern China region, Pearl River Delta. Some people refer to local urbanized local villagers coming together in the shareholding structure, being the owners of the change. Very positive and optimistic. It's a great example of the grassroots democracy and so on. Some other people will see this as part of part of the state entrepreneurial pursuit, which kind of, somehow incorporates the local villagers into that kind of property-oriented mechanism. And therefore, and also resulting in the massive, kind of eviction of migrant tenants, and therefore it's very much a source of contention and so on. So the kind of same process is being seen in two different kind of perspectives. And so I think this is probably what the question reminds me. The role of government and central and local government. I think this is something, again, we can think about the state in a very nuanced ways. I mean, of course, the state can be interpreted in various ways, but if you kind of think of state as a way of as an entity that actually pursues economic development, and this is part of the state entrepreneurial state discourse and so on. Well, I think we need to also not forget that one of the major functions of the state, including Chinese state, is the resource reallocation, resource redistribution and reallocation as well. And that also comes very much together with the state function for retaining some degree of stability, and also very much in a fundamental to the ways in which the state can retain legitimacy as well. So those two functions, resource reallocation, redistribution, and economic development, will go together. Different emphasis being put on different aspects of this relationship. Yeah, and I think more nowadays on the presidency, there's been more emphasis on resource reallocation to retain stability. And I think this is where I think the role of the government, when you talk about that role, we probably need to emphasize more about that responsibility. Government has retained for a very long time, which is kind of re-emerging again. And I think we probably need to speak to that role to be strengthened further if we really want to talk about how these kind of problems, which are affecting many people who are in vulnerable conditions, ought to be somehow rescued. Yeah.
Anything to add?
Well, I think in response to your questions on what a future may look like, an alternative model that is not state-led. I recall reading in the early 2000s like neo-leftist literature on all kinds of co-op experiment in China. But like these are very much things on the side, different cooperative rural co-ops that can work, different shareholding arrangements and so on. And the other I guess question we have here is why urbanization, right? A lot of it is to solve the agrarian problem. And we can also see, the Chinese government being quite active in promoting the countryside as a place beautiful, worthy of, you setting up your business there. You can, do Taobao and, sell things online and make, like venture capitalism, perhaps, So I guess rural countryside as a space of, possibility and like revitalization that can be, something to be explored further. And it's being, something that is being done as well.
Thank you. Yimin or Bill?
Yeah, perhaps I can try to engage with your question, because I know you have an answer in your mind. I'm thinking that nowadays there is another trendy topic on Xiaohongshu. That's about the 县城, county town, or other like very small third or fourth tier cities. People just go to do tourism to enjoy different aspects of those part rural, part urban life, different from the biggest cities. And many of the people who originally from these places, they are thinking about going back. I'm not sure, I'm a little bit reluctant to see this as a promising direction to search for an alternative mode, because this may be just a route for escape. It's quite conservative attitude, and also it's selective attention paid to certain aspects of the life. So it's, I don't know, but perhaps this is a direction that we can go to look into. Yeah.
Do you want a final word?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I will say on this first question of what should the government do, or how can the government address this? Why is the government in this situation? I'm trying to build an argument as part of a book that I'm writing that China is in some way trapped in this cycle of a certain brand of authoritarianism and land rent dependence, really since land reform in the early 50s. and that there's a structural aspect of Chinese politics that predisposes the state towards this kind of governance and dependence on land. Second, in terms of central versus local, a lot of the problem that we see in urban real estate and in this whole property bubble is really a relic of the 1993 fiscal reform and the readjustment of fiscal policy and revenue between local and central governments. And so on that level, yes, there is an imbalance and that could be corrected. So one thing that maybe could be done is the center could start assuming some more responsibility for what are essentially unfunded mandates at the local level, like education, health, other kinds of welfare, public security even. All of these things could be better paid for in larger percentage by the center. That would ease some of this pressure. But I don't know if that solves the whole problem. I don't think it actually does. In terms of something positive and an alternative model of urbanization coming from China versus the rest of the world, one thing that I think is remarkably positive, and I'll close with this, if we look at China's urbanization, flawed as it is, oddly timed as it is, et cetera, the delivery of urban public goods and services relative to the per capita GDP at the time is nothing short of astounding. If you look at most of the world, GDP goes up first and then urban social services and public goods slowly follow. But if you look at everything from schools, healthcare, public health, sanitation, transportation, environmental protection even, at the local level in cities in China, it's well above what you would expect versus the progression of per capita GDP. So in that sense, for all of its flaws, China has done several things very well and really gotten it right when it comes to a certain aspect of urbanization.
Thank you. That's a great note to end